In this particular century, the treatment of mental and emotional problems has been very much of a growth industry. It has become a major industry involving tremendous numbers of people, in some form or another, literally millions of people. It has, particularly in the period since World War II, has become more and more pervasive in so many different ways, whether we're talking about the fields of psychology and psychiatry, in the professional sense, whether we're talking about all sorts of books and seminars that are directed at the average person or the general audience, the so-called pop psychology, looking at various self-help groups and self-help books, all sorts of seminars, all sorts of things, that this combines as a very much of a major factor. And I think a lot of times we don't realize the extent to which the whole outlook and perspective of modern psychology has really, to a great extent, shaped the 20th century and shaped the sort of the worldview that an awful lot of people have about life and how to handle life. And yet, in the context of a multiplication of specialties in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, a multiplication of books and groups and seminars and so many different experts and so many different approaches that have been given, we find seemingly more and more people who are increasingly paralyzed or at least crippled by disabling attitudes, disabling behaviors. Attitudes and behaviors that disable them. In other words, make them unable to live, to function, to cope, and deal with life in a healthy and a productive way. Now, this is an awfully big subject, and it's obviously not something that we can cover all aspects of in a comprehensive way today. I would like today to examine some aspects of the problem that exist from a biblical perspective, and I would like to point out specifically something that is, we're told, is specifically guaranteed to make a person equipped to deal with life, to make a person fully capable of meeting life's demands. Now, I am paraphrasing a quotation, and I'm going to show you that quotation a little later. I'm going to show you where and exactly what God lays out as what He has provided in that way. What is it that can make us, or what has God provided for us to completely equip us to meet life's demands? Well, we're going to notice that a little later. But to begin with, let's look a little bit at the problem. Now, I started out by making some comments on psychology and the field of modern psychology. Let's stop to look to begin with. What is psychology? What does the term itself mean? Well, the word psychology is composed of two Greek words, psyche and logos. It literally means the study of the soul. Psyche is the Greek word, or psyche as we pronounce it in English. The study of the psyche. Psyche or psyche is the Greek term that is translated soul throughout the New Testament. And of course, we understand that when you study the concept in the pagan world was of a, quote, immortal soul. That there is a consciousness you have apart from the body. And that consciousness is something that goes on and continues to exist. And this, of course, this pagan concept that was very common with the ancient pagan philosophers and is carried right on over into the ideas of many of the modern religions of Protestantism and Catholicism. But when the Bible talks about soul, that's not what it means. The term that is specifically rendered soul in the New Testament, the Bible uses three terms, translated body, soul, and spirit. Now, of course, we know what the body is. The soul refers to the mind, to the individuality, to that part of you that is uniquely you. It is not something that has life and consciousness apart from you, but it is that which we term the mind, or we term that inner part of your individuality, that which is unique to you as a human being, that makes you who and what you are. Your thinking, your character, your attitudes, your memory, all of the things that are unique to your mind. And this, of course, is all included in the biblical term soul. It is a reference to the individuality and the mind of the person. The spirit, of course, can refer either to the spirit in man, that which God imparts, that is what really sets us apart from the animal realm. It is something that is not the man, it is within the man. It is something that imparts the ability of perceiving and functioning on a human level as opposed to an animal level, and yet it is incomplete because it needs to be united with the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, in order for us to be complete and whole. So, psychology is the study of the psyche, the study of the mind, the study of those things that make individuals unique, that comprise what is termed the mind or the psyche. Now, in terms of modern psychology, and this is something that dates from really the beginning of this century, the very end of the 1800s, on into this century, there have been certain ideas, certain schools of thought that have been very pervasive, that have really shaped the thinking of much of the 20th century. And if you were to look, there was an article, I think, back several years ago in the Plain Truth, focusing in on three individuals in the 1800s who did more to shape the thinking of the 20th century than any other men. And I think it was an article that Mr. David Hume wrote, and he focused in on Karl Marx, on Charles Darwin, and on Sigmund Freud. And the fact that these individuals in their particular approach, their theories, their writings, more than perhaps any other individuals of the 19th century, served to shape and give shape to the 20th century. Now, God talks about in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 13, prophesying against the prophets of Israel. I've explained before that this term for prophet, as it is used here, is a term that is a pretty broad term. It literally means those who announce, those who proclaim. It is something that refers to a much broader group than simply a few radio or television preachers who really only reach a very small segment and really only influence a fairly small segment of American society. This is a term that would certainly include them, but it includes a lot of the secular false prophets as well. Because, the primary religion of the 20th century is a secular humanism. It is a secular religion that may retain the name of God, at least in some cases, but really has very little focus on the God of the Bible. Well, these individuals, these opinion molders and shapers, the whole realm of those that we would term the media, both the secular and the religious media, those to whom people look for answers, whether on television or on the radio or in news magazines or newspapers. These are the prophets of Israel. Those that are the shapers of opinion, those who announce and proclaim to the people, the ones that are looked to as a source of information. God indicts them for having, in verse 6, for having seen vanity and lying divination. In other words, their messages have not been based on truth. And in verse 10, he says that his people have been seduced into a false sense of security. The joints of the block are not securely cemented together. It's not reinforced. He's talking about a wall that is built up. You can compare it to somebody just stacking cinder blocks and building a wall, and someone else coming along and putting whitewash on it that somehow, if you put it on, thick enough, it sort of covers it up and makes it look fairly solid. You can't tell because they stacked it. But what happens? Does the whitewash give substance to it? No. It makes it look like a solid wall. You stacked up cinder block. If you stacked them up straight and you were careful in the way you stacked them and didn't have them crooked, you can stack them up straight. You can come along and whitewash it, put several coats of whitewash on it, and you would look as though you had a pretty substantial wall. The only problem is, as soon as you pushed against it, it would all fall down. Now that's what he says. They built up a wall and they came and daubed it with untempered mortar. And then he says it's going to fall down. When the wall is fallen, verse 12, it'll be said, where's the daubing wherewith you've daubed it? You've done a whitewash job. So, God says in verse 14, I will break down the wall that you have daubed with untempered mortar, bring it down to the ground, so that the foundation thereof shall be discovered, and it shall fall. You'll be consumed in the midst thereof. Now, God talks about the fact, the edifice of our society, of our civilization being built up, and He describes it as like something that has been stacked up with blocks stacked up. It's been whitewashed. It's been made to look permanent and substantial. But he says the time's going to come when the whole thing is going to fall down. You ever built up? I'm sure most of you had, particularly if you got little kids. You know how they like to stack blocks, and they build up this thing, and it gets higher and higher and higher. And sooner or later, the whole thing falls down. Maybe they just haul off and hit it, and it falls down and goes flying all over the place. There's no substance. There's no stability to it. Well, God says that is descriptive of our society. And He said, when it all falls down, I'm going to see that the wall falls down. And it's going to become apparent that what has been put on it is not something substantial. It's been a whitewash job. And the foundation thereof shall be discovered, and it shall fall. The foundation shall be discovered. And that's something that is important to focus on and to get back to the foundations. Now, much of the foundation of a study of human beings, a study of human behavior, a study of the way that people should relate and connect to one another. It carries over into every field of endeavor. It carries over into family relationships. It carries over into community relationships. It carries over into an approach and an attitude of society toward crime and punishment. It carries over into all sorts of aspects of society. The outlook, the fundamental approach that has been given in this 20th century that go back to much of contemporary psychology. Much of a contemporary study of the mind, study of that which is uniquely human. Now, reading here from an article on a man by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. It's Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a German philosopher, Sigmund Freud is normally thought of as the father of modern psychiatry and the psychoanalytic school of psychology. He is much of that is considered to have proceeded from him. But actually, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a little older than Freud, was the man who perhaps more than any other influenced Freud. And so if you dig down to the foundation, you really have to dig back even a little further than Freud. A man by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. I have an article here on him that I want to read a few excerpts from, because it is important as we're going to look a little bit at the foundation, and we're going to compare it with what God says. This article states that the ideas of contemporary psychology have greatly influenced the society we live in. And many of those roots, we need to be aware of the philosophic roots of psychology. Many of those roots are easily traced to the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 and died in 1900. He was an older contemporary of Freud. He is the German philosopher who is famous for having proclaimed, God is dead. That was not something that just came out in the 60s. Nietzsche is the one who proclaimed that. Now, the reality, of course, that Nietzsche is dead and God's still alive. Nietzsche's been dead for almost a century, but God lives. God was around a long time before Nietzsche ever came along, and God been around for eternity and will be for eternity. So Nietzsche did not start off, very good. We're told, we already have him pegged, because God says in the book of Psalms, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So in that sense, we sort of have him pegged to begin with. We don't have to peg him. God's already pegged him, and he really pegged himself by saying something like that. But he proclaimed himself history's greatest psychologist. So he was not particularly noted for humility among his other problems. And he goes on, and he declared the foundation of his philosophy, and he is really the philosophical father of an awful lot of 20th century thought. Tremendously, very heavily influenced Karl Marx, very heavily influenced Adolf Hitler, very heavily influenced Lenin, very heavily influenced Sigmund Freud, very heavily influenced many of the founders of some of the most destructive philosophies of the 20th century. He declared that God is dead, and he declared that something new must replace the old biblical God. New values, new gods, and first and foremost, a new psychology, a new study of the mind. Because you see, the concept of a study of the mind, a study of the psyche, where does that start? Well, does it start, if there's a God, then perhaps it starts with Him. But if there is no God, then it has to start somewhere else. Well, Nietzsche's replacement for the old psychology, what he called the old psychology, which he assumed to have been based on the Bible, and some of it was and some of it wasn't. A lot of it was other forms of paganism and sort of a blend of Christianity and paganism, but he assumed that that was representative of the Bible, and he called for its replacement by a new psychology based on an ancient Greek god, or based on what he himself in his own writings termed the demon Dionysius. Now, Dionysius was a god in Greek mythology that let me read you a little bit about him. Dionysius was the ancient Greek god of wine and theater drama, a schizophrenic character representing freedom without boundaries, drunken excess, unrestrained sexual abandon, and frenzied violence. He is described in classical mythology that Dionysius everywhere taught man the culture of the vine. In other words, how he was considered the father of winemaking. Taught man the culture of the vine and the mysteries of his worship. The worship of Dionysius was centered in these two ideas so far apart, of freedom and ecstatic joy on the one hand and of savage brutality on the other. The god of wine could give either to his worshipers. Throughout the story of his life, he is sometimes man's blessing, sometimes his ruin. Dionysius was man's benefactor and he was man's destroyer. This strange god, the gay reveler, the cruel hunter, the lofty inspirer, was also the sufferer. Well, you can trace elements of the story of Dionysius back through Nimrod. You can trace some of it back into the pre-flood world to one of the descendants of Cain by the name of Jubal, who was sort of a forerunner of that. Elements of it could even refer to Cain, and ultimately it is a reference, of course, to the satanic spirit that was the inspiration behind all of those. Dionysius is the god of chaos and destruction and the god of fertility and productivity. He is the old nature god of Greek mythology, and who comes to life in the spring and brings all men together in joyful intoxication and abandonment. You know what the Roman name for Dionysius was, don't you? Bacchus. Now, they're going to be having, within a short period of time, a big celebration down in New Orleans. And one of the great, one of the leading things that is illustrated in the Mardi Gras parade, of course, a lot of it centers around Bacchus. It's just a continuation of this sort of a thing. Isn't that a pretty good description of it? Let's see, where is it here? The God who comes to life in the spring brings all men together in joyful intoxication and abandonment. Isn't that a pretty good description of Mardi Gras? Bacchus is just the Roman name. The Greek name is Dionysius, the same character. Well, Nietzsche figured that this was the model. This is where he looked for his inspiration of normalcy. Now, you can figure that his attitude towards the Bible was here was a man who absolutely hated the Bible. He made the statement, one had better put on gloves before reading the New Testament. The presence of so much filth makes it very advisable. As an artistic triumph and psychological corruption, the Gospels stand alone, he said. He described the biblical God as an invention that needs to be discarded. And he urged men to reject the Gospel in the New Testament. So he said that the concept of God was invented as a counter-concept of life. Everything harmful, poisonous, slanderous, the whole hostility unto death against life, synthesized in the concept in gruesome unity. This is what he had to write. So he was a pretty nutty character. He began his teaching career in 1869. Started out as a classical scholar who taught Greek studies at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And as a model of the best and ultimate human being, he chose Dionysius, a Greek god, a demon, because the Apostle Paul makes very plain the things that the Gentiles worship, the gods the Gentiles worship were demons. Paul makes that very plain in the New Testament, that we might just note there. The ironic thing is that Nietzsche in his writings referred to Dionysius as a demon. He knew what he was doing. No question about it. But Paul says very plainly in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 19, he says, what say I then, that the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons, and not to God, and I would not that you should have fellowship with demons. And you can't drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You can't be partaker of the Lord's table and the table of demons. Now he was talking about partaking in pagan rites, pagan festivals. The context, of course, 1 Corinthians 10 had to do with meat offered to idols. But Paul makes it very plain that what was really behind the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods, the Babylonian gods, the false gods of the world, what was really behind those gods were nothing other than demon spirits, demonic fallen angels, and ultimately Satan himself. So here was Nietzsche who decided that the model of the ultimate human being, the best and ultimate human being, was Dionysius. And he went to Greek myth as his source of information and decided this was the model of the ultimate human being, diametrically opposed to the biblical Christ. And so he drew that contrast even in his own writings. Coming on down, now what influence did he have on Freud? Well, Sigmund Freud, as well as the intellectual leadership of German-speaking Europe, adopted Nietzsche's psychological terminology with some reinterpretation, but they largely kept the core set of Dionysian concepts. Freud names Nietzsche as his precursor, thereby recognizing his immense contribution to the development of modern psychology. Sigmund Freud remarked in an autobiographical sketch that he wrote that Nietzsche's premonitions and insights often agree in the most amazing manner with the laborious results of psychoanalysis. So he considered that he admired Nietzsche. With no credit to Nietzsche, because Freud didn't tend to give credit to where he borrowed things, but he employed most of Nietzsche's terms and concepts. Various other schools of psychological thought grew out of Nietzsche's, some of his thoughts. His basic premise, of course, was that man is only an animal, and all that has to be done is, man is merely an animal. The emphasis on unrestrained and unbridled freedom. There's an awful lot that traces back there. Now, let's go on. Let's look a little bit further at Freud himself. I have an article here that was written back several years ago in 1986 in a cover story in Insight magazine entitled Psychoanalysis, Identity Crisis. It says psychoanalysis is a profession under attack. Critics are casting doubt about its every aspect, from the credibility of Freud, its founder, and the validity of his ideas to the profession's cultural and moral influence. It goes on, there are various things, and it says, psychoanalysis is a little like advertising. It seems to be everywhere. It costs a fortune. Nobody's really sure how well or if it works. A lot of people don't seem to think very much of it. And like advertising, it comes under periodic attack for its alleged advocacy of immoral or antisocial values. Criticisms that as often as not emanate from practicing or former professionals. Now, in recent years, psychoanalysis has endured a series of attacks. Some have focused on the character and motivations of the movement's founder, Sigmund Freud. A former analyst, Jeffrey Masson, is charged that Freud suppressed vital information, altered his theories to protect an incompetent colleague, and repair his own damaged professional reputation. A British writer, E.M. Thornton, has suggested that many of Freud's fundamental ideas were a product of both a misdiagnosis of patients and his own advanced cocaine addiction, because, of course, Freud was a cocaine addict. And so there are various things that have come out here that we could go into on some of that. I don't want to get too far off on some of that. There, of course, have been various approaches. We could say that there are four basic approaches that modern psychology has taken in terms of its explanations, and there are many smaller groupings that come out from this, many smaller schools of thought and more specialized focus. There are those who have sought to take little bits and pieces from each of these, but there are four basic schools of thought, and they sort of divide up into two basic categories. What could be termed as the first category, the first two of them, are what would be termed determinism. That just simply means that your behavior, your conduct, the things you do, have been determined by the things that have happened to you. That you are simply, the whole emphasis is on the fact that your past determines your present and your future. The third and fourth approach fall in a little different category. They emphasize what could be termed more of a free will approach, and that is the fact that they emphasize the fact that you have choices and that there is an element of free will, free choice. Now, if we look at these approaches, the first approach that is more the original approach of Freud himself, the psychoanalytic approach, sometimes called psychic determinism. It's the approach that Freud had, and he went back. Of course, if you look at the people that he studied and the things that he came up with, all sorts of weird ideas that he had, a lot of which was concocted from his own interpretation of Greek myth, the myths of Oedipus and others in Greek mythology, which he put his own slant on, a lot of which he borrowed from Nietzsche, and came up with his attitude as to what in the past shaped the future. Now, there were those that, such as B.F. Skinner and others, that split off from Freud and took an approach called a behavioristic approach. They tended to view man still as pretty much an animal, and figured that it was simply a matter of taming him. It was a matter of training. It was a matter of conditioning. That everything was a matter of conditioned response. Now, both of these categories, the problem with both of them, if the approach that each of those gives, that your present and your future is determined by your past, then you run into a problem, because when we read the story of Peter's sermon in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, he went through and explained what had happened, and we're told that his audience was pricked in their hearts and said, "What shall we do?" In Acts 2:37, and Peter said in verse 38, "Repent, change, turn around and go the other way." Now, Peter seemed to act from the premise that we could change our present and our future. We could change our whole course and direction of life. Now, the behaviorists would have said, well, what these people did was, they were simply conditioned. Their response of crucify him was simply a conditioned response because of their growing up. And, they weren't responsible for that because they had just been conditioned that way. And Freud would have, I won't even go into some of what he would have said, but the whole point is that the message of the gospel is predicated upon the fact that human beings can change. That we do have responsibility, and we have to accept responsibility for our actions. That there is forgiveness for our sins, which of course presupposes there is such a thing as sin. And that we can change our directions. Now, does our past affect us? Well, obviously. The things we've learned, the things we've experienced, all these things influence our thinking, but we're not some sort of computerized, pre-programmed robot that has to go through life reacting only in certain ways because of the things that have occurred previously. There may be many things that have contributed to bringing us where we are, but ultimately we do have, and the Bible is very clear, because the gospel has no meaning if we do not have choices. And God sets before us choices. Peter made plain the truth, and God convicted these individuals of the truth, and Peter gave them a response. He said, repent. He said, change. So there is a chance to change. Now, the latter two of the four major schools of thought, of psychological thought, do emphasize that aspect of it, or they acknowledge that human beings are capable of changing, that it's not just a matter that everything is predetermined. One of these is sort of the third school we could call a humanistic approach. They like the term self-actualization. You know, that's a pretty meaningless phrase. What does that mean? Well, they like to throw around a lot of names that when you hear it, it sounds impressive, but it's sort of a meaningless term. You can break it down and ultimately come to what they think they mean. But the emphasis, this humanistic emphasis, it is a man-centered approach. It is a self-centered approach. Now, those who take this approach, this third school of psychological thought, has its emphasis on, quote, being good to yourself, and all the emphasis on self. And they would tend to view that the self is the starting point and the center of everything. Now, the problem with that is, Jesus said in Matthew 22, is self the starting point? Is that the center of everything? Matthew 22, verse 37, when the question was asked, what is the great commandment of the law? Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. So you're to love Him with all of your psyche, your psyche. That's the word soul here in verse 37. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So Jesus Christ talked about a God-centered life as opposed to a self-centered life. I'm going to come back to some of this a little later and notice how some of it begins to put together. But the emphasis of this humanistic school is to really focus in on the self and on self needs. And it is a very self-oriented focus. The fourth school of thought, psychological school of thought, is what's called the existential school, or the transpersonal school. And here the emphasis is on freedom, is on the fact that you should not allow anything, any outside code to control you. That freedom is the ultimate, and the whole emphasis here is on freedom to be yourself, and to again, a very self-oriented approach, an approach that focuses in on freedom, but it focuses in on freedom with a standpoint of something that focuses in on freedom from a standpoint that it really misses the point, because it is an approach that would disregard anything that would come from some outside source as a controlling factor. Now, when you understand freedom, the Bible tells us something about freedom in Psalm 119, verse 45. It says, I will walk at liberty, for I seek your precepts. Verse 44 says, so shall I keep your law continually forever and ever, and I will walk at liberty, for I seek your precepts. So real liberty is connected with God's law. Now the existentialists wouldn't like that because they think that if you subject yourself to some outside, some exterior code, something that doesn't totally originate within yourself, that you're giving up your freedom. You see that what you need to do is that you can have a code, but it has to be something, quote, it has to be right for you. What do you mean right for you? What if maybe keeping the Sabbath is keeping the Sabbath, quote, right for you? What about murder? What about thou shalt not steal, or is that, quote, right for you? Well, the point of God's law is that there are things that are right for everyone. The Ten Commandments are right for everybody. They're right for you, they're right for me, and they're right for the whole world. But, this particular approach, they are very much against anything that imposes some sort of some sort of code that is an exterior code. They feel like it all has to come from inside. Well, it can become inside. God's law can be written in our heart and in our mind, and then it is internalized. But it has to originate in an external source. The Scripture says in Jeremiah, it says that it's not in man that walks to direct his steps. The way of man is not in himself. Jeremiah says that in Jeremiah chapter 10, that in 10:23 he says, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself." You're not going to come up with a way you ought to live and function just sort of spontaneously produced inside of yourself. The way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. There is a need for guidance from an external force. Now that external force can internalize that guidance into ourselves. The gospel message is focused on proclaiming liberty because God's law, when we understand it, God's law is the pathway to liberty. God's not against liberty and freedom, but He's against He's against false liberty. We're told of certain ones that Jude warned about who, while they promised them liberty, they lead them into bondage, for they themselves are the servants of corruption. All the while that, Nietzsche proclaimed Dionysius as the epitome of freedom. The god of revelry, sexual abandon, of alcohol. Of course, drugs has been the contemporary addition to that. Well, where have those things led? They've led into all sorts of enslaving addictions. They've led into life-threatening diseases. They've led into some horrible things. Well, there are places we could go. When the gospel message has to do with proclaiming liberty. In Isaiah 61, proclaim liberty. Jesus Christ came recorded there in the book of Luke, and read that scripture. That's why He came. We're told in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. You want to find liberty? Where are you going to find it? You're going to find it in a drunken orgy somewhere? You're going to find it by casting off the restraints of some, quote, external code? No, what you're going to find there is slavery. What you're going to find there is a lot of pain, a lot of heartache and headache and grief. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. The point that we see is the more we examine the foundations of some of these things, the more flawed we find that they are. Oh, there are bits and pieces of things that may have some validity to them, and I don't want to get off into all of that, because there certainly I'm not saying that there is nothing that has ever been learned or understood. Certainly human experience has some, it's possible to learn from human experience, and there are things that can have some value. But what is the controlling and the determining and the mindset? What is the basis? What is the means by which we're able to see and evaluate these things? Well, it has to get back to the fact that the only sure word of truth is God's Word, the Bible. Now, if you want a story, if we want to illustrate the problems in terms of disabling behaviors, of attitudes, because ultimately the behaviors are the results of attitudes. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, the Scripture tells us. You know, the problems, whether the good things or the problems, they start on the inside. Jesus said it's not those things that go into a man's mouth that defile him. It's the things that come out. It's the words and the actions. Because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So we go from our words and actions to our thoughts to our attitudes. Sort of a step-by-step approach, because our attitudes feed our thoughts, and our thoughts feed into our words and our actions. Now, if we want to look at an example of someone whose behavior, whose attitudes gave rise to thoughts and actions that were totally disabling. In other words, they made him unable to function in any sort of a healthy way. I know of no more clear-cut illustration than the tragic story of the first king of Israel, King Saul. There are several things that we learn as we look in 1 Samuel at the story of Saul. When we first meet Saul here in 1 Samuel, and we meet him in 1 Samuel 9 and 1 Samuel 10, we find that Saul had a particular approach, a particular view of himself and his abilities. The statement that he made about himself is found in 1 Samuel 9:21. Saul answered and said, "Am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why are you speaking thus to me?" Well, as we come on down a little further in 1 Samuel chapter 10, when in chapter 10, verse 20, when Samuel caused all the tribes of Israel to come together, the tribe of Benjamin was taken. The tribe of Benjamin came near, and the family of Matri was taken, and Saul, the son of Kish, was taken. And when they sought him, he couldn't be found. And they inquired of the Lord further, and it was revealed that, behold, he hides himself among the stuff. And they ran and fetched him hence. Now, Saul, we can very clearly see, felt inadequate. Saul was an individual who felt very inadequate. This was his attitude that was down inside. Now, we're all inadequate for various things at various times, and he was called for a job that was pretty overwhelming. If he had felt totally adequate for it, then maybe he would have had problems of a different sort. He felt inadequate. That of and by itself was not a sin. The problem that arose was, how did Saul deal with his feelings of inadequacy? He felt inadequate. He was overwhelmed at the idea of being king, was so terrified of taking on the job that when they called his name, they couldn't find him. He was hiding in the closet. I had to go, come bringing him in. Had to go find him. Here he was. Well, as we come on down through the story, we find that Saul developed certain approaches towards dealing with his feelings of inadequacy. And we want to compare some of Saul's approaches with King David's approaches. Because David was the next king. And they both found themselves in difficulties. They both found themselves plagued with various problems. How did Saul respond? Well, we find that in chapter 13 we find the story of where the army had been gathered. They were waiting to go out and to go to war against the Philistines. And they were gathered together, and they were waiting for Samuel to come. And 7 days went by, and time came, Samuel had not arrived. And Saul took matters into his own hands. Now, we find why he did so. Because in verses 11 and 12, when Saul gave his excuse to Samuel, Saul offered the sacrifice, which was unlawful for him to do. He was usurping the role of the priesthood and did not have the right to do that, but he did it. And his excuse was he was scared. He was scared. He was scared that the army was sort of melting away, and the Philistines were out there, and Samuel hadn't shown up, and Saul got scared. And fear became a very controlling factor in his life, and he went ahead and did what he knew he should not have done. And this, of course, came in the first year of the second half of Saul's reign. He reigned for 40 years. This is in the first year of the second 20 years. So, when we find that God rejects Saul, it's not that, Saul had gone along, done everything right, and made one mistake, and immediately God pounced and was ready to get rid of him forever. It was the fact that Saul had become increasingly unwilling to deal in a positive way with the problems and the feelings that he had. You can come on through the story a little later, and in chapter 15 we read of how they had gone out to war against the Amalekites, and instructions had been given for the destruction of Amalekite property. When Samuel came down there, they hadn't destroyed it. Now, first Saul said, "Oh yes, we've done the will of the Lord." And Samuel said, "What's all this bleating of sheep and lowing of oxen I hear?" Then Saul began to pass the buck and said, "Well, now the people, they saved the best of it. The people did this." And we're told that what we have here in verse 24 of 1 Samuel 15, Saul says, "I feared the people and obeyed their voice." What we find is that Saul's response to his feelings of inadequacy, Saul felt inadequate. He felt inadequate for life. That of and by itself isn't a sin, because all of us are inadequate for a lot of things. Saul felt inadequate, but he responded to his feelings of inadequacy through fear, and his thoughts and attitudes were fearful thoughts and attitudes, and they resulted in behavior that was controlled by that fear, rather than controlled by God's instruction. His fear became the controlling factor. Well, as you come on down, we find the story of David and Goliath. Well, of course, Saul was fearful of Goliath too. Now, we'd already read Saul stood head and shoulders above all the men of Israel. Saul was a pretty good-sized fellow. When the giant of the Philistines came down and challenged the Israelite armies, you can bet who they were all thinking of. They were thinking of Saul. Not only was he the king, but we're already told he stood head and shoulders above everybody else. So he was a pretty good-sized guy. He may have been, close to 7 feet himself. Now, he wasn't nearly as big as Goliath, but he was a big man. And here was Goliath coming down taunting the Israelites. Well, you can imagine who they were all thinking of, and Saul knew who they were thinking of, and there was no way he was going out there. He felt inadequate, overwhelmed, fearful. And of course, this attitude and this behavior was transmitted to the whole nation. Well, David came down there, young boy, perhaps about 18, and because 20 was the age of military service in ancient Israel. He came down there as a young boy, perhaps around 18, and he brought farm produce down from his father to his brothers, and he heard Goliath out there, and he said, "Who is this guy? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine challenging the armies of the living God?" And they said, "Shh, better be quiet, he'll hear you."